So we can start, as we said, okay, I have the floor, do I? No, I see Hans-Peter. Is Hans-Peter about to say something? We got seasick, Hans-Peter. Hello?
I hear anything? Hello, hello?
Hans-Peter, hello. Yeah. Hello from Geneva.
Hello from Los Angeles to Europe.
Wonderful to see you.
Bonjour, Geneva. Guten Tag nach der deutschen Schweiz, soweit sie vorhanden ist. So, hello, I'm really excited to be part of this birthday party going around the world. It was now going around for several hours, and I can tell you it started with a fabulous party on our side where we had a group of young people so enthusiastic that suddenly for a few while discussing with them made me clear that young people going forward will help to keep the internet in a way we like it, we expect it, and we hope it. And at the same time, we had the inductees to the Hall of Fame and all the former inductees of the Hall of Fame. So we saw that there's history. And it's a way through different feelings. You feel young for a moment, and suddenly you realize you are with us for 20 years, 30 years, you are suddenly feeling old. So it's a great thing, and we have to go on, and we have to keep it on. And I hope you have a good group and a good discussion to start about things, how we can do to continue to make the internet better. Back to you, back to Geneva.
Thanks a lot, Hans-Peter. So thanks for your nice words. So everybody knows Hans-Peter. Hans-Peter Dietler is one of our board of trustee members. So let's start with our discussion of the day. We are online, and I'm very pleased to, in a few seconds, introduce our really great panel. The reason why we opt for the Internet of Things is not a pure coincidence, as you have heard from the presentation of my colleague. In our futures report, we were very concerned to see that indeed a convergence between the internet and things might just be posing a lot of different issues at security and privacy level. And this is exactly what we will be talking about in a few seconds, whether or not it will have an impact on people and on people's trust in the internet, those 20 billion sensors and Internet of Things. So in order to talk about this, we have, well, I believe, one of the most wonderful panels that we might just ever dreamed of. And I will start introducing each of them, so please bear with me. We have 3 Hall of Famers in this room, starting with you, Robert Caillot. You were one of our first inductees in 2012. You are, of course, well known for the proposal developed with Tim Berners-Lee of a hypertext system for accessing documentation that eventually would become the World Wide Web. You also produced the first web browsers for the Apple Macintosh in '92. And then in '93, you started WISE, the first web-based project at the European Commission. You, of course, worked with CERN to produce and get the document approved whereby CERN placed the web technology into the public domain, for which we're so thankful. Just then, François Flukinger, you're also a Hall of Fame in 2013. You are a leader of the struggle to promote the internet in Europe, and you are the one who convened back in November 1988 the founding meeting that led to the creation of RIPE, the Réseau IP Européen, the non-profit European organization that conducts the technical coordination of the infrastructure of the internet. You also contribute in '92 to the creation of eBone, the pan-European internet backbone, and you arranged in that same year for the European organization, the CERN, to become a founding member of the Internet Society, for which we're also very thankful. And in your free times, and I'm a fan of it, you also draft some wonderful cartoons about people in the internet. Thank you for this. And last but not least, for the Hall of Fame, Ben Siegel, you were an inductee in 2014. Ben, very kindly, I would just decrypt you or picture you like a maverick. I mean, you were someone who always struggled to promote the internet, even in the period of time what it was not very politically correct to do so. So where IP, you got a lot of stories that you can tell us, I mean, where you would using IP within and outside your lab. So I know tons of stories that you can tell us about it, but you're also, of course, known to be the one who enabled the web's development by coordinating TCP/IP adoption within the CERN from 1984 to late 1988, when CERN changed its internet policy. And for CERN's internet developers, you were their first introduction to the IP stack and the Berkeley socket application programming interface. We have Monique Morrow. Monique, you are president and co-founder of the Humanized Internet, a non-profit organization focused on providing digital identity for those individuals most underserved. But you're also an associate researcher at Alexander Humboldt University Institute of Internet and Society. And last but not least, you are co-chair to the IEEE Ethics in Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous System Mixed Reality Committee, in addition to being a member of its executive committee. Thank you for being there. Alberto Pace, you are a member of CERN. Thank you very much. You're a member of the IT department, where you lead the data management group, ensuring a coherent development process for physics data management activities, strongly driven by operational and user needs. And you got more than 20 years experience in computing services, infrastructure, software engineer. So thank you for joining us. Last but not least, Roxana, I'm very happy to welcome you. You are not only the chair of our ISOC Swift chapters, but you're also a program manager at GIP, the Geneva Internet Platform, and maybe one of our next Hall of Fame, who knows, if you continue to do what you do best, and that is you being a doctor now. After your PhD, you've been awarded the Swiss Network for International Study Award 2017 for your PhD on global rules for emerging issues domains, negotiating the governance of the internet. And the jury, I understand, was extremely enthusiastic to the way you managed all those complexity of governance and the internet. So thank you for being there today. I will start with a very candid question, but before I do that, please remember, we are in the Internet Society here, well, hosted by CERN, and the principle is that this is really interactive. So I will ask you in turn in a few seconds after my first question to the audience so that we have a really nice conversation with the panel. My first questions, and I will start with you, Robert, if you don't mind. My first question would be very candidly, while talking about the Internet of Things, what are the privacy and security threats that you feel are really concerning? So what do you see as the big picture for those issues? Please.
Yes, thank you. We had some discussions about these things before, and my first objection was perhaps to the title, Undermine the Internet of Trust. I have never known an Internet of trust. You know, you can only undermine something that exists. This is probably the most fundamental thing to discuss today, that is trust, because all of these issues are about trust. And it's about trust in people that are far away, can influence you instantly, and that you have never met or probably will never meet. So this is a very, very big issue. To come back for a few seconds to the Internet of Things, as I said in a talk some years ago, maybe we should first get some of these things to work properly. Today, already this morning, we saw the failure of the microphones, right? We saw the failure of the presentation of at least 2 people. And then somebody mentioned the toaster. Was it you who mentioned it? No, somebody mentioned the toaster on the internet, right? Well, first give me a toaster that will brown the bread to the shade that I set instead of working on a timer, right? This seems to be a technologically extremely difficult problem, much more so than connecting it to the internet. So we have problems that are different from connecting things up to the internet. And finally, I'd like to put the whole thing into perspective. We should do our bit and try to think about these problems, because that's where we can help. But we should never forget the bigger issues of the planetary issues, you know, the overpopulation, depletion of resources. It all has to be subservient to solving those problems first.
Thank you, Robert. I'm so happy I started with you. I mean, I'm now very depressed. I mean, no trust at all. So who will help here? Alberto, can you say a few words on how is your thought about IoT, trust, privacy?
Well, these objects are entering in everyone's home. And today, what probably is one of the major issues is the lack of awareness of the end of the consumer and the end users about the privacy concern that this device can bring by taking data that are personally and then shipping to the manufacturer of these objects.
Okay, thank you. Ben, what are your thoughts? Just a warm-up, huh? And then I will get back to you guys. Please.
Well, as a technical person, the problem of Internet of Things is a staggering problem in scale. We're talking about 1 or 2 orders of magnitude increase, 1 or more, of the current Internet, with all its problems of governance, its problems of security, its social problems. We're talking about scaling that up by several orders of magnitude. Also, the devices that we're connecting don't have the space, the power, and the resource of most things which are connected to the internet nowadays. The other scaling issue, which is pretty hair-raising, is that all this is being done on an exponential curve that's speeding up so much more than when we built the internet 40 years ago, and since CERN 20 years ago, 20-odd years ago, 30 years ago. That scale of increase of speed is just hallucinating. So that's just the scale of the difficulties. One last remark, if and when we solve this problem, then we have to start all over again and add AI into the picture.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Please, Roxana.
So I'd like to bring in the user and the governance perspective here, because when we talk about a trusted internet, this is a rather subjective measure. I trust the device to do what it is supposed to do. So I have a smartwatch, I trust it to do what it's supposed to do and not share data beyond what I consented to ideally, or at least what I am knowledgeable of. However, what we see in practice is quite different, and then we have to probably think beyond the issue of trust to the issue of trustworthiness. Can some of these devices actually communicate to other trusted devices rather than having the responsibility on the user side entirely and thinking that in the end the damage will be with me personally? And in that context, I'd like to maybe discuss 2 myths. One, that sharing is caring. We've heard this over and over again. The more we share data, the more we have information about ourselves on the internet, the better it is for us. Our lifestyle will benefit from this, our well-being as well. We are sharing more, and thus it's better for all of us. But to take an example, if we think about health-related devices, that is not necessarily the case. In fact, what we see is that some insurance companies introduce policies that make you wear a bracelet that can monitor your activity all the time. And according to that, you have different subscription levels. So that means that the IoT devices are also used as a form of control. And here is where we have to think about the right to disconnect or the right to be invisible to some of these devices, because it is not just about favoring those who are part of it. It's also thinking about those who are not part of it or who would like at some point just to be able to disconnect some of these devices. And I'll stop here for the moment.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. François, please.
Thank you. To predict what may happen with IoTs, it may be good to have a look backward to the predictions some of us made in the early 90s at the inception of the internet. So in 94, I wrote a book where I said that my fear for what I call at that time profiling. So at that time, there were, Robert, maybe a few hundreds of servers in 94. So I said, clever servers will try to learn what our tastes are from our requests. After a while, they will restrict the suggested activities and cultural programs to items they match our profile. The probability of impromptu discoveries or cultural revelations will be drastically reduced. And I concluded, the internet sows the seeds of an impoverishment of the spectrum of people interests. I believe this has materialized indeed. And I think that the Internet of Things will add a new dimension to profiling, because the system will not only observe what we do, but also what objects we have and what they do, the objects. So I have some fear there. Another prediction I made was what I called disintegration of the face-to-face socialization, in particular for the youngest. I wrote, with the internet, movies on demand and remote computers games may constitute new departure in solitary activities. This is particularly worrying for younger children. And I concluded, probably the way internet will be used reflects the overall trend of Western civilizations towards individualism. So again, this has materialized, I think, and I think the Internet of Things will worsen that situation, because in addition to playing at a distance with people and systems, our kids may also play at a distance with their objects. So this will add a new dimension, I think. This sounds a bit negative, a few other negatives, but other positives, but we will come back to that later.
Sure, I hope so, yeah. Thank you. Monique, please.
So I'm glad we're warming up still. Yeah, listen, I have a couple of points. I think the key point for me is around what I think is a trust deficit in our society with these things. So things transacting with things is a major issue. What is the intentionality of a device that has been created? Do we understand what intentionality of usage means? And are we communicating to consumers, for example? This goes into the notion of safety. If we think about so-called smart homes, let's say, for example, I use an exploit or a vulnerability to go into somebody's house such that it results in somebody's death. Who, in what entity is responsible? Is it the manufacturer of the device? Is it the service provider who allowed the intrusion to come in? And the answer, I was told by some legal authorities, that it is actually the consumer. The question is, does the consumer know that? So that gets into how law becomes defined in these cases today. The other notion is around data leakage and the whole notion of our own sets of identities and privacy. You know, I always ask the question of whether or not we are in control or whether or not people care, right? So data leakage is another issue, and it becomes a major issue when we're thinking about the General Data Protection Regulation that's coming up in Europe on May 25th in 2018. How is that going to look? And the last point I will make is that we're now looking at employees microchipping at the moment. So think about 3 Square Market. I think it's a company, and I believe it's in Wisconsin, that are now microchipping themselves such that they can come in with a microchip and actually pass through security. What happens when that employee is no longer an employee? You just pull the chip out, or what? So we're really into this space of things, but things also at the human level. So it's not to paint a dystopian society, but it is around how we communicate. Just as usage of technology, just as you have a pack of cigarettes to say that somehow this may cause cancer, are we communicating effectively?
Wow, thank you very much for this first warm-up. I mean, seriously, you touch upon so many different angles. We will have to choose one by one. I mean, starting with trust, the deficit in trust, awareness of users, the scalability, the mass surveillance, well, what Bruce Schneier would call the surveillance capitalism, the fact that we are in a society where there are so many incentives actually to just make surveillance on us. Let me go, unless there is someone who wanted to ask already a question, please. Wait a second. I should have something to launch to you. Is that okay, or Howie? If I do that, can you catch it? Oh. Well done.
Well, hi, I'm Thaisa Shali from Y Coaching and Consulting. I have a question in matters of trust about reciprocity and the Internet of Things, because we are talking about what you're giving out and what you're getting in return. So we say ignorance is bliss in a way, because you don't know, you could get more, so you're happy at some state. And we all talk about key performance indicators. I like to state it at key satisfaction indicators. So what's your take on reciprocity with the Internet of Things, and in particular with health tech? It's something you touched upon. I'm really interested in that.
Who want to take it? Please.
Well, clearly you're giving out your data and you can get a very good price on the device, up to the point that companies may give you a device for free.
Do you like the answer?
No, because I think right now there's much more than what you could give. And talking about personal example, I'm mentoring many startups, and one in particular in health tech, and they're working on something that is groundbreaking. Obviously, they all say this, but is the notion of reciprocity with your health data. Right now, it's not happening. You know, you have all these objects, connected objects, and you're not getting as much as you should get because you're giving the information out. So what are they giving you? You know, so. You know, I think money may be.
So I find that as an excellent question, because we are, whether you're the connected body, the connected human being, you know, you go 10,000 steps, and who is, what entities are collecting that device, that information, and for what purpose? Who are the actors involved? The actors could be insurance players, they could be your employers, et cetera. And so I don't know what the correct answer should be, but it is a question to ask, you know, what are you giving in return? And whether or not you should ask the question, if I'm sending data, you know, to ask that question. Why am I sending data? Why are you pulsating all of that data? Why do you choose to do that? And because you are a product. We talked about that at lunch. I mean, you become a product, and now you have to be concerned about what does that mean to be a product and how you turn things off. Now, you're in the healthcare background, I guess, but it is a question because the danger here is that I could take that data and say, you know, and give it to your employer such that you have a health problem, or maybe you're diabetic, or whatever, and then you don't know it. So there are players. It was always a question of who owns my data. Well, of course, the answer is you own your data. It's like Copernicus, you know, the sun is the center of the universe. Well, you should be the center of the universe, and you should be asking those questions. That's the only response I could give here.
So let's continue in this way then. I didn't want to go this way right now, but as you obviously opened this avenue, no, let's go this way. So let's not forget, we're talking about 20 billion sensors soon, and I take some of the line that I like from Olaf here, whatever you put on the internet is part of the internet. So you imagine the kind of privacy issues that we may be facing. So we better discuss the transaction that we have. What are the economics here of privacy? As you just say, I mean, I give something, what do I have in return? Who should we turn to in order to make this transaction okay with us? I mean, do you believe, and I'm open the question to you, that the market will solve this? Is the market, I know, Robert, we discussed this during lunch, so I will start with you. Do you believe that eventually the market will find a way for me as a user to be happy with the transaction? Will there be someone as a competitor who will put privacy as a differentiator? What do you believe? Will the market try to fix this? Do you want to take it?
No, I don't want to take it.
But you have the mic, so go for it.
But I have the mic. No, I don't think the market will solve this at all. And in any case, in this, if you look at the differential equations, you will get monopolies. In fact, we have monopolies. We have world government in the form of Apple and Google and all of those guys, you know, Facebook. They are the world government. They decide what you see, what you don't see. They decide to upgrade my iPhone without my consent and stuff like that. So, and they are all outside my legal space. So I can't do anything. Right? I'm stuck. And I can't not go on it or with it. But, you know, you can't stop the evolution of this in any way. And therefore, if there is something bright on the horizon, it may be a global AI that may decide not to exterminate us.
Asimov.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Someone else, please. Roxana.
I decided to be a little bit more skeptical on the power of artificial intelligence to govern the world properly. We've been trying to solve this to govern, full stop, yes, not properly. So when we look at AI and IoT devices that implement AI, of course, we have different architectures in place. And one of the underlying questions here is whether we can go ahead with the governance system we have right now for the internet and assume that many of the IoT issues will be integrated in that governance structure, or whether we need to think of a completely new institutional setup to tackle this. And both of these come with opportunities and a lot of risks, obviously, because right now we're talking about users potentially getting locked into certain technologies, not having the power to disconnect, trusting a so-called black box, really not knowing how these devices communicate, and still trusting that there will be a way to make it fair for them in terms of price, in terms of the data exchange, and so on. So right now, I think the biggest question we are facing, and maybe it's also the biggest opportunity we have, is defining the governance framework in which all of these devices will operate. And I do believe it is also up to us to be part of this, because we see an expanding range of stakeholders that have something to say on this and should be involved in the process. Not only manufacturers that were never concerned with this, think about producers of video cameras that weren't connected to the internet before, baby monitors and so on, but also users that have come into this as their world. So if you think about the new generation, people who are exposed to this from day zero, day one of their life, and will have to live in a world that is completely dominated by such devices around them. So the question of governance, it's really at the core of all of this, and it is a great opportunity for us.
Thank you, Roxana. I'd like to come back to that later. François, please.
Yeah, I would like to come to that point on the role of manufacturers. I see a major technological threat to the future internet from a technology point of view, and this is the risk of the already existing fragmentation of the technology. Look, when you send a letter, when you place a phone call, you do not have to bother. How is my recipient connected? What does it use at the other hand? Because the interface we use is a standard, it's universal. We know what the format of a letter is. We use a single telephone without having to know what is at the other end. It used to be the same for internet applications. It is still the same for email. We send an email without knowing. We may use whatever interface we want, but without knowing whether the other person is using protocol A or B. They all use SMTP and the internet protocols. However, they started to be different for new applications. Look, when you want to place a video conference with someone, you have to know, what are you playing? Do you have an Apple? Which application do you use? And more, it gets complicated, more and more complicated with the mobile devices, because most of the time we use applications. So we have seen already the end of the universal internet. For basic web surfing, we still use the same standard, but beyond that, it's all proprietary. It's quite concerning, this fragmentation. Can we do something? Maybe in the internet, we, the technologists, were a bit too slow, for example, for video conferencing. We were a bit too slow to come along with stable standards, even simple, and Skype take over with their proprietary system and others. However, I think that it is time to be conscious that we may be nearing the end of the universal internet in terms of technology. That's it.
Okay, well, yes, you're right. I mean, we should address fragmentation. And by the way, this fragmentation, the one you describe, is just happening with our full support of users, actually, because we are full users of those many apps and wallet gardens anyway. So we may be willing to address this. I'd like to come back before we get there again to what you just said, by the way. Okay, so we got the idea that the market might not be willing to address this or to fix it, right? So some people in our community believe and start being very vocal about the fact that it might just be an open door to regulation. What do you think? And I would like to extend these questions to the audience. Do you believe that's the end of the kind of candid years of the internet where we now need to get back to governments and asking them to regulate, or regulators to regulate, so that the kind of ugly thing that we're discussing here, you know, the threats, the vulnerabilities, the liabilities of some actors should be addressed by regulators and governments. What's your thought? I see Richard waving his hand, then you, let's start with you, Richard.
First of all, I agree with everything the panel said. But I think you should rephrase it a little bit, Frederick, because I think we should get away from this myth that somehow the internet was never regulated. It was always subject to national laws, and in some countries, the national laws were such that, in particular in the US, the internet was not regulated the same way as the telephone system was regulated. But slowly, even in the US, certain things are coming back, like net neutrality. Legal intercept was added to the internet quite some years ago. So I think you're asking the right question, but I would rephrase it a little bit. What do we think is a correct level of government regulation or not regulation? Because in some areas, I do think the government shouldn't intervene at all, but in other areas it should, and I think that's how I would phrase it. And forget this myth that somehow the internet once was never regulated. That's back when they were starting it, and I was at MIT at the time, and there were 10 servers. After that, it already started somehow to be affected by normal laws and regulations.
So, you? Thank you.
Who was that? Oh, yeah. Good for catch?
Yeah.
Francois Gray, University of Geneva. I'm surprised we got this far in the session without saying the word blockchain. And, you know, we're talking about trust, and blockchain seems to be, without getting into all the hype, a new paradigm for trust, peer-to-peer trust that circumvents top-down governance of governments, but also of large corporations. What do you think about that?
Okay, let's keep that. I might turn to, please.
I want to also focus on the Internet of Things. With government not forcing the companies to regulate stuff at the moment, at least not in most countries, how long do you think will it be with it increasing as fast as it is now, that there's enough public pressure that the politicians will get the ideas on their own that they might need to change something? And what disaster or scandal would speed that up?
So can I take one?
Please.
Yeah, these are great questions, by the way. So I'll go blockchain, and then your last question, which was really an awesome question too. Libertarian view. I mean, you know, you have this is the whole issue around transparency around block, the whole notion of what is registered and it's distributed, and the whole notion is that there is not a centralized authority behind it. So at best, the only thing that you have to look at is what are the implications to privacy. It's pseudonymous as best. I can probably deduce by the transactions and the cipher exchanges that maybe it is so-and-so doing that. But, you know, that's something that is in play today. And I think that, as I said earlier, as a comment to Richard's panel, you know, that cat is already out of the box. To your question, so watch this space very carefully, because I think that's going to be very interesting around transparency, the whole topic of transparency. To your question around regulation and where, so Richard is quite spot on, you know, parts and parts of what we've been talking about as the quote unquote internet is, they had a regulated space, and recall that the origin is around ARPANET, DARPA, and that was a U.S. defense experiment. Having said that, I think what will happen, I strongly believe in multi-stakeholder. I do believe that you need private and public cooperation here. But it goes to the question, because technology is moving so quickly, to the earlier panel, do people, government authorities, understand what the technologies are and what the implications are to society and safety? Because they have to. What happens typically is an accident. If I say Equifax, data breach, 143 million Americans, and as of 48 hours ago, 400,000 UK citizens, that's a data breach. That's data that gets everybody up, right? So when you have something, a data breach, an accident, a series of accidents, I think people start to, or entities start to wake up. And the last point I wanted to make is I strongly believe that we have to think about some notion of a cooperative code of ethics when we're talking about technology, thing development, and some kind of code of honor of how things will be used cooperatively amongst manufacturers themselves, right? And I think that has to be more public. That's my take.
Thank you. Before you ask or you make your comment, I believe we need to discuss this, Monique, as well. There will be, Windsurf always says that there might just be one dead person soon, someone in his chair with, a remote control, but someone in China will just press something and his chair might just, make him like a fresh orange juice or something. I mean, the moment there will be someone who will just die from the Internet of Things, there will be a knee-jerk reaction from governments and there will be a massive regulation of a whole lot of things. So I'd like to come back later.
It goes to my hypothetical.
Exactly. So we need to think a bit of what might just be the future looks like which kind of governance do we need. I come back to you, all of you on this one. But please, Olaf.
Yeah, I promised to channel questions from the room, okay. from the InterCommunity room. And Tony Donahue had a question that actually relates to something that I care about deeply, is suppose that everybody wants to do the right thing. Suppose that everybody wants to build, decent security in their fridges and light bulbs. These companies that are now moving into the IoT don't have the history and culture with respect to security that the more traditional device manufacturers have. So even if you want to go into a more positive, supposedly everybody wants to do this, how do you get to the proper amount of knowledge and clue within those stakeholders?
Well, I think that we should try to be a little bit optimist. Clearly, we are just at the beginning. This is a major revolution that is ahead. So from our standpoint, trying to guess the future is extremely difficult. The technology evolution that we can expect in the coming years is so impressive in all domains that it will make no difference today between bringing a computer online or a device online, because very likely the new device, even the tiniest one, will have all the normal TCP/IP protocol stack that you find in normal computers. So today, at the beginning, we may have a very, very little tiny device which have very, very little memory, and so they run stripped down versions which maybe are vulnerable or not patched, etc. But very likely this technical problem may be solved. But it's extremely difficult to understand how intrusive this new technology will be in everyone's life.
Which is, please, Robert.
Yeah, I agree with you. We discussed this some last week. This technological problem of the difference between the manufacturers of these new devices and the more traditional ones will just go away. That isn't really a problem. What is a problem is where do you put the different boundaries or shells or areas around you where you let things come in. I mean, my light bulbs, even if they are IP capable, I see no reason to ever have them on the wide global internet. I mean, they should stay this side of my router or whatever is there in the future. So there's maybe a shell type structure that we can imagine where these all the devices operate in the same way, using the same technology, but there are different levels of boundaries there to guard things better.
Roxana?
The internet was built with a lot of collective intelligence. It was built bottom up, and it's one of its main strengths. I think our challenge today is to try to apply that collective intelligence again and effectively. We know it's very difficult, but if we can do things openly and using open source and open debate, we have a chance. Monique, by the way, gave a talk earlier this year at TEDx Geneva, where the theme was, are we in control? We have to try to remain in control on this. We're on this helter-skelter, and it seems to me the only way to deal with an exponential like this is with an exponential increase of intelligence. Hopefully that is going to be human intelligence, and well-intentioned human intelligence. That's our challenge, to couple that, and whether one is an optimist or a pessimist, I don't know.
I definitely agree that the question here is, where do we as a society come together to define the limits of what should and should not be online, what is to be taken into account ethically, and what shouldn't be a consideration for a machine. And in reality, if we are to think ahead, most likely we will have a mix of different governance mechanisms. There will be some soft law, there will be some hard law, and some attempts for self-regulation. And even if some devices are capable of regulating themselves, they will never do it in connection to the much broader ecosystem in which they operate, right? So the interest of those who create them or a smaller community will take priority over the interest of all of us together as a society. And for this, I guess, and also to answer the question from the online community, maybe we need a forum for discussion. Maybe we need a place where we can sit together and have this collective thinking that is really primordial at this point in time.
So, unless someone else needs to take it. Yeah, please. Ready?
Well, the things that we connect to the internet, or people connect to the internet, why are they connecting them to the internet? For their health, for their comfort? The question is, how much of their humanity, how much of their privacy are they willing to give away for that comfort? What if they choose to become more citizens of Apple, or citizens of Samsung, or Microsoft, rather than being citizens of Switzerland? How can the country, how will the independent states be able to legislate on that?
I will turn to you to answer this, right? I guess another question from this lady here. Howard, come back.
Sorry, excuse me. Catch.
Please do.
Yeah, so this has been a very interesting conversation, and we've been talking a lot about giving away our data to big companies and whether or not governments play a role in this, in regulating this environment. And in support to Richard's statement, yes, I think this has caught government's attention. In fact, we have a database called Cyber Law, if anybody wants to look it up, where we can see what different cybersecurity law is in place in different countries. But I think another interesting question that I would like to also understand is, like, what about giving our data away to the governments itself? Say if governments want to access the data for the purpose of security, and say they can say that this is part of the governance, if that's the right thing to do. I mean, it's of course interesting to draw the line on how much data we should give to big companies but also to governments. I think something to think about, or if anybody has their views on this.
That is the balancing act. I go back to, I think, the earlier question around blockchain. So you have governments involved. I mean, think about it. I had been working with some refugees. It didn't matter that they had digital documentation available. What governments were looking for was the provenance of the paperwork, right? It didn't matter. And so your marriage certificate or your university degree or your social security number, somehow that comes to you by a government. And so it goes back to who do you trust, and in what format do you trust? Could you imagine taking your identities and your sets of identities and papers in a digital format with you at any point in time? What if Switzerland doesn't like you anymore? You know, can you go someplace else? And that goes to a harder problem of data sovereignty, or sovereignty overall. I go back to things, and the whole notion of things where, you know, whether or not you have a light bulb connected to the internet or not. I agree with you. You probably don't want a light bulb connected to the internet. However, you've got these smart devices. Think about Alexa and all of these devices in your home listening to you, photographing, listening, and you can tell Alexa or any of these types of devices to do what you want. And I was just in a cybersecurity event, and now you've got the capability of having a video feed to your baby, and if your baby is crying, you can just create music up through a video feed and rock the baby, et cetera, et cetera. It gets a little creepy after a while, even in your own home. And do you know the implications of what it is you're doing, from convenience sake, to your point, convenience to am I a digital member of or citizen of Apple or Amazon or whatever that looks like? Convenience versus are you really aware of what it is you're doing, and how is that being communicated in itself, right? So look at that digital television that's watching you any point in time, and collecting data about how you are moving around. And I think that we need to be really cognizant about. And sometimes I think consumers just aren't. And so it goes to the question of whose responsibility is that?
Thank you. Robert? And don't forget you.
Yeah, that was an interesting example of this baby watching camera there. I have a few devices like that, but they never communicate outside my own local area network. So I can trust them there because it doesn't, I didn't buy the camera with the link to the guys who bought the camera, who sold me the camera. Right? I'm not going far away and coming back. I'm staying in my own home. And I think that, again, is part of the awareness of people. They buy these things and they are just not aware that there is a leash linking them to the different companies.
Yeah, but unfortunately, users are not all Robert Caillot, who has a reputation to code pretty well everything in his life on his own way. But kidding away, you're right. It might just be part of users' awareness that we discussed a few minutes ago.
Well, it's to the point that you just made. People need to know how things are used and not to allow that leakage to occur elsewhere. And so when that accident, the theoretical accident happens, you know, it goes back to who is responsible at the end. And the consumer doesn't, the consumer is responsible. The consumer just doesn't know that per se.
Well, Alberto, go for it, and then we have a question.
Yes, please. Just one comment, because everything we are describing is already happening today with the mobile phone that everybody has in his pocket. You know, there is a camera, there is a microphone, loudspeaker, GPS. So basically, your entire private life is already being recorded, and it's in many cases, it's uploaded in real time in either the Apple universe or the Google universe. So the question very often boils down is not a different problem, is already a problem that we have today, and it boils down to having probably a better education of the users, and again, the awareness that the data is constantly leaked out. And there is no difference between the mobile phone and the Internet of Things device that you buy.
Right. So it goes to how do you turn off some of the GPS capability, who's responsible for all of that, sort of the privacy knobs that you want to have, and what does that look like? So, and it goes back again to convenience. Do you actually want to have, when you buy a mobile, this is my question, right? Hypothetical question. When you buy a mobile phone, do you want to have sort of this license of, you should understand its usage, here's how you put privacy controls on, et cetera, to communicate to the consumer, as a device manufacturer or as a service provider? I mean, these are the questions to ask, getting the consumer to understand why or how this technology is used, and you put tracking on, understand that you will be tracked, location accuracy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it goes back to an area that I amplify all the time is education.
That's pretty cool, I agree. Roxana, and then I have a question, please.
Very quickly on the question of identity, will we become citizens of Microsoft, Google, and so on, as opposed to deciding to be citizens of a particular state? It is a very good question, and I think we don't have the answer to that yet, because what we learn right now, in addition to just finding out a lot more about objects around us, it's also a lot more about ourselves and our interaction with these devices. Corporate governance is obviously expanding. There is that threat in the background that we might actually decide in 20 years from now to opt for a corporation as opposed to being the citizen of a state. But this is where we need to bring in the rights and the code of ethics that we, as a society, decide to abide by if we want our society to not be transformed in ways that are unimaginable. So here I go back also to the right to be invisible to some of these devices. Maybe not everything has to be collected about you, and maybe you can decide to disconnect at some point or to disable things around you so that only what's of absolute need and use is taken on board, and not every single thing that moves around you.
François?
Still on this question of awareness and the impact of these IoTs, there might be a consequence which is not triggered only by this IoT, but they may amplify it. Ben, you talked about collective intelligence. My comment is about more individual intelligence. We have observed, studies have shown, published this year, that in developed countries over the past 2 decades, the results of IQ tests are slowly ramping down. There are many reasons given, explanations given, and we all know that IQ tests are very questionable. But one of the central questions is, after all, what is intelligence? What do we mean by intelligence? So I have my own definition I use for myself that I suggest, which is the ability to resolve with your mind new problems. Resolve with your mind new problems. Now, I think that our style of life and the internet, plus the internet, reduces the opportunity to have to resolve new problems. And this may contribute to the reason of this amazing IQ slow decrease. And the IoT may amplify that, because they will, by doing more and more things for us, they may reduce our exposure to new problems. This is another example where awareness, and I think this is central, awareness of the citizens is essential. And this is where organizations like ISOC could be extremely active in creating awareness.
That's part of the plan, by the way. Thank you very much. Monique, you can go very short, because I have been told by my colleagues that we only have, what, 2-3 minutes to end up this conversation.
We were just warming up. No, listen. No, the awareness. So just really, really quick. listen, one of the implications of what Francois said is that we have information at our hands, and we're seeing that constantly. Maybe it's data pollution, I don't know, but it's information at our hands. And I was at a university, and I spoke with a chancellor of that university, and what the chancellor said, these students have so much information, they are Googling it, quote unquote. I just want them to ask a question.
Oh, yeah. Very good quote. I apologize for those who had questions, and including remote participants. I will have to end up this conversation with asking each of our panelists to just give one line as a takeaway for the people. I missed something in this conversation. That was my next question that you addressed, Roxana. What kind of governance and what role for stakeholders? I would love to hear you talking about what role for the SDOs like IETF. We talk about proprietary standards, Francois and Ben. What would be the role of IETF? What would be the role of our society or community in there? From users, what would be the role of governments? Well, if you can squeeze this in your answer, that would be perfect. But I will start just saying, we got 3 minutes left. So what is your takeaway from this conversation, Robert?
I think that everyone is responsible for their own increasing awareness. So we all have to work on that. It's not going to be given to you. You have to do it yourself. To study, listen, inform yourself, work hard on it.
Thank you. Alberto?
A lot of is coming, and we have to understand that this is happening because the opportunities for new services are huge, and that's why there is massive investment. So it's another revolution that is upcoming, and it's better to be prepared, be educated and aware.
Thank you. Ben?
Yes, my hope will be that the younger generation who has to inherit the good and the bad things that we've given them can make an adequate job of it.
Thank you. Roxana?
Easy job there. I think we will need to move the conversation from trust on an individual level to trust in an ecosystem and in a set of institutions that are there to guarantee some of this. So part of the governance discussion, bringing these safeguards to the user and to us as a society.
Thank you. Another debate. Francois.
We, or at least I have been a bit negative, but we should not forget that any major breakthrough has its own drawback. And remember, when Socrates was absolutely opposed to writing, he said, look, forget about these bloody things of writing, because if they write, they will forget, they will never remember anything, they will believe they know and they will not know. This was his idea, and the funny thing that we only know that because Plato wrote it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well done. Monique, then, last
so yes, you are the center of the universe, and I believe that we should build a community cyber bill of rights.
Very, very nice quote for the final. Please help me to clap this wonderful panel. I guess we've done the job, or we are just on time, are we?